Governor Walker was unable to join us today, but I know that she would like us to pause for a moment to remember her good friend, Governor Norm Bangerter, and all of his contributions to the state of Utah. I just want to also introduce myself. I'm Carol McNamara. I'm the director of the Olin Walker Institute of Politics and Public Service here at Weber State University. Governor Walker founded the Walker Institute together with Senator Milner, then President Milner, who is here today, to about 3 years ago, and their vision was to create a center that could produce forums like this one today that bring together students, community members, university faculty and staff to discuss the challenges and issues that are important to the continued success and prosperity of Utah. And to make, of course, the Walker Institute the home of a growing government and public service internship program at every level of government. At the city level, county, state, our program is growing, and also in Washington, D.C., so that we would be able to enhance the education of students through those internships and to provide them with professional skills that will enhance their postgraduate prospects as well. We're grateful to all of our supporters and our donors for supporting the rapid growth of the Walker Institute. In particular, for this particular event, we're grateful to the Barlow family. This is the Haven J. Barlow Spring Civic Leadership Forum and Zions Bank for all of their support in making the Walker Institute and these events possible. I would also be remiss if I didn't thank my assistants, Carla Price, without whom this event would never occur. She contributes so much. My intern this year, Ashley Cawley, is somewhere. There she is back there. The Walker Institute Board of Directors and our Student Board of Directors, who always show up to help. So I'm grateful for their support. Also, Carla always reminds me there are a couple of things. One, if you parked and pay parking, make sure you get a validation. If they wouldn't let you into the parking lot that we reserved for this event, and you get a ticket, then make sure you give us your ticket, and we'll take care of that as well. Just one more promotional item. There are buttons and chapstick and all kinds of Walker Institute swag on the table. Please take it. There are also donor cards if you would like to support us in our efforts to support students in the internship program and to continue promoting these events. In the fall, we have our Constitution Day event. We have our Haven J. Barlow twice a year, our Leadership Institute, our Citizens Academy, and other events that work together with the community to educate and promote political knowledge and participation. Okay, today's event, sorry for that long-winded preamble. Today's event is our Haven J. Barlow Civic Leadership Forum, and it addresses the subject of the state of contemporary journalism. Is Twitter the new newspaper? And what does that mean for informing the American public and holding public officials accountable? We have an amazing panel that braved the elements to come up from Salt Lake City, and for which we are grateful. Doug Wright, our moderator today, has long been recognized as a trustworthy voice in the Intermountain West for over 40 years in the broadcast industry, largely spent at KSL Radio and Television in Salt Lake City. One of the things I told the panelists, I was just going to say at the beginning, they all have a lot of awards. So they're all very impressive and well awarded. So I'm not going to read all of their awards. Robert Gerke is the senior government reporter for the Tribune and has covered Utah politics for 18 years. Debbie Dukvanovic began her career in television with CBS, moved to NBC, Fox, KSL, the FBI, and then back to KSL. Is that about right? Okay. Ben Winslow is a multi-platform journalist for Fox News, experimenting with new technologies and ways of sharing news across multiple platforms. And finally, Lisa Riley Roche covers politics for the Deseret News. KSL News Division, producing content for the newspaper, TV, radio stations, and so on. She covered the Olympics and Mitt Romney's campaigns as well. And finally, Jean Norman. Our own Jean Norman is the professor of journalism here at Weber State University, and she started her career as a journalist, and she's moved into the ranks of professors, and she's the advisor for the student paper, The Signpost. Please welcome all of our guests, and thank you again for coming.
What a pleasure it is to be here today. It really is. And thank you for being a sponsor of this gathering. I look at, Haven Barlow here and what an influence he's had on our great state. And it was mentioned the passing of Norm Bangerter. And I couldn't help but note, as I was getting ready to come up here, the last time I was here, it was one of the opening events. It was October of 2012. And not only was Governor Walker here, not only did we have Mike Leavitt via Skype, not only did we have the current governor, Governor Gary Herbert, but we also had former Governor Norm Bangerter here. So the last time I really had a chance to talk with Governor Bangerter was here at the Walker Institute. I have such an enormous regard for Olene Walker. I always wondered, what kind of governor would Olene Walker make? And I remember asking that of Nolan Karras. Nolan Karras laughed, and he said, let me tell you, anybody that thinks she's just a sweet old lady, I still have her footprints all over my back from when I was Speaker of the House. And her 14 months as governor was just remarkable, and her service to the state of Utah remarkable. So it's a real honor for me to be here. And it's an honor for me to share the stage with colleagues, some of whom I have worked with and currently work with, others that I simply admire, read, and keep up on. So it's a great honor to be up here. At any time, we've reserved a little time at the very, very end for you to step to the microphones. But if at any time you feel the need, the urge, have a question, have a comment, a clarification, please step up and we'll note that you're there and turn the conversation to you. That's such an important part of all of this. One thing that has intrigued me that I've heard from my colleagues in our own newsroom, I've heard it from the newsroom of the Tribune, I've heard it elsewhere, that there is such a pressure on us today to turn the news and turn it quickly, and not only to turn it in a traditional way, get it on the air during the next newscast, or getting it in the next edition of the paper, or the next regularly scheduled internet update, but it's an immediacy. And has Twitter become the new medium? Has it become the way that we do share the information and share it first? This morning, just before Senator Lee was on my show, I was notified, and I guess everybody else that Senator Lee knows was notified that he'd be on my show to talk about Senator Rubio's and his plan for reformation of the tax code. And it's playing an increasing role, but what I'd like my colleagues to address is what kind of pressure is that putting on them, on their newsroom? What high priority is your newsroom putting on it? And your ability individually to draw individuals to whatever source it is, whether it's to the paper, whether it's to the internet, whatever it might be, and have your tweets draw listeners, draw viewers, draw readers. What kind of pressure is there on that, and do you believe in any way, shape, or form it compromises or does it enhance the ability to cover the news? And I'd like to throw it wide open. I don't want to make this formal, just go up and down and make sure that we get a little blurb from everybody. But who'd like to respond first? Debbie? Uh-oh.
Hi.
There we go.
Hi. I've never gotten along with microphones. Yeah, it's like my whole career.
I don't know either.
Microphone on. Is it working?
It works.
I keep dropping stuff too. Here we go. You good? Oh. Sorry. Stand by. These are my notes. I think it's certainly. So I've been in television news since 1989. Right. I was in long before I ever knew about the internet or Twitter. I mean, we just went to the courthouse and got documents and actually talked to people back then. Now we look up documents online and make phone calls from our seats at work. But I think it's put a whole new dynamic on us, on me in particular. Part of the issue I have as I continue to grow old in the news business is remembering to tweet. Unlike my former colleague here and friend, Ben Winslow, he's tweeting all the time. So I'm tweeting right now. and my phone's in my purse because I need a break from it. But I think it's created a whole new dynamic. And I think it's a resource, but I don't think it is replacing the newspaper. Lisa, you get to go back with me and continue to write. You will not be replaced by Twitter today or tomorrow or the next day. And I certainly don't think it's replacing investigative journalism. And that's a whole different issue than a tweet from the side of the road because it's snowing outside, and there's a lot of legal issues that go into investigative journalism that I could spend hours and days discussing. But it's certainly a way to alert the public much more quickly than we've ever had in the past.
Do you have pressure to tweet to draw viewers to?
Absolutely, there's pressure. There's pressure in any business to bring more customers in. And Twitter is one tool to do that. I don't know if it's always the best tool, but it is one tool. Facebook is another tool. Instagram is becoming another tool. So, and I think we have to be responsive to that. We can no longer hide as journalists, no matter how much we're aging and want to hide with the new tools out there, from the new tools out there. We have to adapt to them and become pretty prolific at them.
Lisa.
Well, journalism has always been an incredibly competitive business, and we're really lucky in Salt Lake that we still have 2 competitive print newspapers. We have competitive TV outlets. Utah is a single TV market, so you've got all of the network affiliates competing to cover the news for the same marketplace. You've got radio news is still very competitive. Twitter is just another way, frankly, of being competitive. You want to be first. You want to get information out quickly. It used to be that, as Doug said, I remember when I started the Deseret News and we were an afternoon paper, all I had to do was work all morning and get a story in by 10:30, and I was good for the day. And then the rest of the day was spent getting ready to do the same thing the next day. Those days are long gone. People want to know what's going on as soon as they can. And it used to be that you would go onto the internet, onto a newspaper or TV station or radio station's website and see what had been posted. Well, now, if you really care about an issue, you're following Twitter. You're looking for live tweeting from an event. Ben, Robert, and I were in federal court Friday covering a preliminary injunction hearing on the Count My Vote case, the SB 54 issue about how the state parties will select their political nominees. We were able to live tweet, which is very unusual in federal court. But anyone who cared about that issue, and remember, this is a smaller group too. We all have lives, right? You guys are in class. Most of you probably also work. You have families. You have issues. You're not constantly streaming media to find out what's going on. But when you care about something, when you want to know right away. And that's what Twitter is good for. It's a way to immediately update the people who care about what's going on. And yeah, it does put pressure. If I am busy taking notes or I want to focus on something in a slightly different way, and my colleagues are live tweeting, well, those are people that may not come to my newspaper later to find out what I finally write. It's just part of the service we provide as journalists now. It's just part of what we do.
Albert? Yeah.
I'll take a crack at it. Maybe. There we go. So 2 quick stories, I guess. And when I was the news editor at my college paper at the University of Utah, my editor came to me one day and said, "What do you know about the World Wide Web?" And I asked him, "Well, what's that? Is it some sort of internet thing, And he said, "No, we can put all of our news on the web, and everybody anywhere across the world can read it." And I looked at him and said, "Why the hell would we want to do that?" And, I had no idea at that time, in the span of my career, it would completely revolutionize the way we do everything that we do. And to demonstrate that, my second story, I got a call from my daughter one day at school. She was at school and said, "Hey, Dad, can you bring some of that stack of newspapers we have down?" And And I said, sure, this is great. They're studying current events, right? And she said, no, we're talking about the news. And there are only 2 kids out of the 28 in their class who'd actually ever touched a newspaper. So that sort of shows where the future is and where the future of our industry is going. And so if you don't embrace Twitter, if you don't embrace the internet, you're going to be a dinosaur, well before your time. And so, yes, Twitter is a tool that we use to kind of reach out to people and put the news where they are. You've got to get it to them somehow. It is, as Lisa mentioned, instantaneous. It's quick, and we are competitive. We want to get things first. There's an old axiom in journalism: you got to do it faster. You got to do it better. Hopefully, and to some degree, you can do both, but at some point, the better starts to slip a little bit in favor of the instantaneous, I think, and that goes to what Doug was saying about the pressures and the impact it has on sort of the longer form investigative projects that we're able to do because of the urgency and the immediacy. Hopefully, we do the immediate, and then we take a step back and provide the context, because that's what's really important, is what does this mean? What does this event mean? And we have to put that into context. And, hopefully we can still do that. I think, to some degree we're doing that less and less than we used to.
Professor, I'm by design kind of saving Ben for last for a reason. Your thoughts on this? Is Twitter becoming the new newspaper, and your thoughts on it?
Like Bob, I have a story that comes to mind as we talk about this. When I was studying journalism, we were taught to grab the payphone first. How many of you even know what a payphone is?
I saw one in the Ogden courthouse the other day. They still exist.
We were taught how to grab the payphone and monopolize it so that we could get our news out. And right now I'm reading a Scholastic article about how the same thing was done with the telegraph. But with Twitter, there's no monopolizing anything, so that it's really democratized the dissemination of news. But it also has made my students, I think in some ways, more informed than they realize. I encourage them to start following news feeds, but often they're coming in saying, hey, did you hear about this? Did you hear about that? And I'm saying, I'll be darned. These kids actually are following this stuff and becoming news consumers. And I'm also finding that in the same way that I read newspapers when I was young and wanted to do that thing, they are studying news dissemination on Twitter or, the aggregating blogs kind of news, and they want to do that thing. They're learning a different type of news gathering. So, Ben, I'm going to let you go next.
Let me set the stage on that, though, and we just evolved into this. One of the best introductions or explanations of perhaps my awkwardness with the internet, my awkwardness with the digital media, is because I was told that I was an immigrant into the technology, where folks like Ben and many of you are native born. This is second nature to you. It's the world you were raised in. How many of us joke about the fact that we go to our kids or even our grandkids to have them help us if we run into a block on the World Wide Web? What the hell's that? And it's true.
We ask that question now.
That's right. So for those of us who are immigrants, those of us who still have the accent, those of us that still struggle with the culture, you're much, much closer to being a native born, if not a native born. Your thoughts on all of this?
I think that, like a lot of people, I do Twitter because I like it. I really do. I kind of, if you've been around me, I'm somewhat hyperactive and have difficulty holding my attention, and it is, I enjoy it for that. I do Facebook, I do, a lot of the other social media platforms, Instagram, and just recently signed up for Periscope. And so I like to experiment with all those things, but I like Twitter just because of the instantaneous nature of it. I don't think it's the new newspaper. I'm sorry, but I do think it is the new newswire. It is the new AP in that sense that it provides a wonderful amount of raw information, but it doesn't give you that context or background or explanation. It can refer you to all of those things, but I don't think it can explain everything. I just want to know, how many of you have Twitter or use Twitter? Awesome. How many of you use Facebook? Cool. How many of you use Instagram? How many of you are Snapchatters?
Woohoo!
Go Snapchat, selfie.
2 weeks ago, Snapchat.
How many of you use Periscope? Or Meerkat? Let's just throw them all in the same category. Or Kick, or Justin TV, or any of those. All right, interesting. That's very telling. I want to know one other question. How many of you read a daily newspaper? Wow, that's impressive. That is awesome.
That surprises
Yes.
me.
Thank
How
you
many
all
of you?
very, very much.
How many of you watch or read your news online exclusively? Not exclusively. Okay. How many of you have your tablet out when you're watching television? Or, your phone or whatever, you're surfing the net, checking Facebook, whatever. Okay. All right. I think that from our perspective, or from my perspective, the days of us, you just sitting down, watching the news or reading the paper and going, and us saying, and that's the news, thanks for watching, good night. I think that's coming to an end. I think that it's going to be more interactive. It's more of we engage, and that's one reason why I like a lot of this social media stuff is you engage with people, you get information, you give information, there's a dialogue and a conversation. So just kind of my 2 cents on a lot of that is it is a rapidly evolving world, but again, what we're doing with social media is awesome, it's wonderful. I mean, at my station, we have an attitude of we break news on whatever platform it is, but it's not the sum total. Again, I can give you bits of data, but I may not be able to give you the full context on that. So,
And the point that Professor Norman made, I think, is an important one, and it kind of dovetails with what Ben was just saying, is that it used to be the newspaper would land on your doorstep, and that was your news for the day. And now it's so much more consumer-driven because you can go anywhere in the world, Huffington Post, Washington Post, New York Times, anywhere you want, and have it there at your fingertips in an instant. And that means, it's instantaneous, it's also universal, and it's consumer-driven. It's not handed down from on high by the suits in the newsroom.
Here's a quick question for all of them. When you see the professions ranked by their credibility and the trust, sometimes our collective group, we fall into the category of televangelists, car salesmen, all the good stuff.
We've earned that. We have, in many respects.
This new ability to immediately get information out, disseminate the news. Paul Raleigh once told me that he felt whenever he put anything on the internet that he was scooping himself. This new environment, the quickness of it, the immediacy of it, and the scramble, sometimes we all crawl all over each other, even within the same camp, to break the news first. Is that helping or hindering our credibility?
Well, we still have to remember that we're professionals. This is a profession for us. We're not just casual observers sharing our what we see, our opinion or our insights into something. We're news professionals, news gathering professionals. We've trained for that. In fact, how many of you are journalism or communications students? Good for you.
how many of you are PR people?
Well, you know what? No matter what you want to go into, make sure you pick up at least a couple communications classes because it really helps you understand whether it's people you're going to market to, whether it's people you're going to serve in another profession. You need to understand what the media does and the power of the media. So that's very useful. But one of the things about Twitter, I think that we all need to be aware of is who's tweeting. Where are we getting the information from? It's great to follow all kinds of people who are really interesting and fun and funny or even kind of crazy or parodies. We all remember the feral cat from a few years ago.
Whoa!
Exactly. But we need to also be aware of what the source of the tweets are. And hopefully everyone here that follows news on Twitter follows news sources that they already know and trust, whether it's Fox or KSL or Deseret News or Salt Lake Tribune, or hopefully all of us. That's the beauty of Twitter, right? You can get a lot of information from a lot of sources and pick and choose. But one of the things to always be aware of on Twitter is know the source. Know if someone announces something or throws out some outrageous statement,
consider where it's coming from. And that's something that we as news professionals really need to emphasize with people. The social media is great, the fact that we can have those conversations and so many people can participate, but news gathering is a profession, and everyone can help out at times, but if you really want news that you can trust again and again and again, you need to go to the professionals to get it.
I think that's why in many instances, and although I'm newer to Twitter, maybe a year and a half old now on Twitter, I'm hesitant to retweet people I follow, not necessarily the Tribune, and maybe that's more of a competitive thing, but I have certainly posted and retweeted Robert's articles before, or the Deseret News. I know they are mainstream, vetted news organizations that are generally, for the most part, going to tell a balanced story in context. And I'll always, I can say probably 99% of the time, if not 100% of the time, read the article before I tweet it, again, or retweet it, I should say. That's very important to me before my credibility. I'll tell you, there was one time I retweeted an ABC News reporter who I had known personally from my time working at the FBI as the spokesperson, and worked with closely on many stories. And it turned out his information was totally wrong. And so, I mean, he tweeted out that he was wrong, and I thought, you know, this is why it's really difficult for me to get into a mode of just automatically retweeting people and their information, because now that becomes, you know, my tweet and my information I'm disseminating to my fewer than, 1,000 followers, but still that's an issue for me. But to that point, I think going back to, what sort of ranking we have in terms of whether we're down there with used car salesmen, I think in many cases, we have earned that reputation, and we've booted, collectively, as a group, as a whole, whether it's national media and we're lumped in as local press with the national media, or vice versa, we've booted our share of stories to get out information before all the facts are known. I've seen that when I was with the FBI from media organizations, not necessarily in Utah, but more so at the national level. And I think we do have to remember that when we're getting ready to post a tweet or post something on Facebook, because that gets retweeted, and suddenly fiction becomes fact. And then we can't get that, as I like to say, that toothpaste back in the tube once it's out there.
What about the credibility of our profession, Robert? And then I'd like to hear from Ben and from Professor Norman as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think as we talked about, sort of this has become more consumer-driven journalism because you can choose what you read now. It's also democratized the other end of it too, because there's a lot more outlets, and some of them are fly-by-night, some of them aren't well established, and so you do have to be, as Lisa said, an informed consumer. You can't just, soak everything up like a sponge. There's also sort of this phenomenon, and a lot of research that's been done on sort of selection, the way people select their news to reinforce their existing viewpoints, and we could go into that as well. But I think, I think the reputation of journalists generally suffers when we see things like the Brian Williams, making stories up, or we see things like the what was the other
Rolling Stone.
The Rolling Stone article, and that hurts all journalists generally. Now, I think on the flip side of that, I think we can. What's that? The Duke case. Yeah, I mean, as Debbie mentioned, there are a number of instances we can point to. Jason Blair, even going back to the Washington Post story about the 8-year-old heroin addict. This is Janet Cook. Yeah, this is not a new phenomenon, but it accumulates and accrues, and if people see journalists not doing journalism for a public good, I think it's hard to rebuild that trust. Now, one of the things that I have found with Twitter and some of the social media is it sort of helps us step beyond the brand, I guess, of what we've got. It used to be, I was a reporter when I was working for the Associated Press. I was an AP reporter, right? Now I work for the Tribune, but I'm Robert Gehrke. I've been able to establish my own identity outside of the institution I work for, and sometimes that can be a valuable thing if you're a reporter, because you can kind of build a persona beyond that, and I kind of view that almost as a survival skill, given the sort of the harsh economic environment we live in. You know, if the Tribune goes under, I'm not going to go out looking for a job as a former Tribune reporter. I go out looking for a job as Robert Gerke, who's built this individual sort of reputation on my own.
Ben, your thoughts?
A lot of this has been articulated. I would just say one thing. You know, this is kind of you see it on Twitter bios all the time, and you kind of chuckle and go, RTs do not equal endorsements. I mean, I think that's kind of a given, but a lot of times what you're doing is just calling attention to something. Look at this. It is still incumbent upon the reader to consider the source, consider whether that is, you know, retweeting people. Yesterday I was retweeting a lot of people who were sending snow pictures. You know, I think it's pretty obvious that, hey, it's snow.
You're not endorsing.
I'm not endorsing snow, but I'm just saying, hey, look at this. I'm sharing in this collective conversation that everyone is having. I think that, you know, especially as we focus on this discussion about, you know, use of Twitter, it's important to, you know, kind of keep that in mind, that it's a tweet. It's not a scholarly dissertation. And so it is something to bear in mind. I mean, I've had conversations with people online before, too, saying, look, this is what I can give you in 140 characters. You know, you want more, here's a television news story I've done, here's a story I've written for our website, that kind of thing. But also, when you're retweeting, you're crediting the original source on this, too. You know, whether it's an eyewitness on the ground, whether it's a reporter that you deem credible or a news outlet that you deem credible, it is incumbent upon the reader to consider that, whether they agree with it, disagree with it, or just consider it.
Do you believe that the tweet really does lead people back to a more meaty story or a longer article or an investigative report?
It can. Again, it is
I'm skeptical
140
too.
characters is only so much. But you can refer people to more information. You can link to it.
I just always wonder, do they really go to it, though? Or do they
I've
go,
heard not so much. And I talked to our social media folks before I came here today, and it's not, we don't tend to get a tremendous amount of traffic to ksl.com if I tweet a .com link from Twitter. It's helpful, and I do think it puts the brand out there. It puts the ksl.com brand. But look, ksl.com news alone, which the source of the news comes from people such as myself and Lisa who provide content to KSL.com. So my stories, for example, will get posted to .com after they air on 10 o'clock news. KSL.com gets 100 million page views a month. 100 million.
How much of that is tied to classifieds?
That's separate. That's news. So classifieds, the marketplace, puts it up to a total of 340 million a month. KSL.com is a huge driver for news in the world, throughout the world. Twitter's not anywhere near that. So I'll go, for example, I can tell from my KSL.com stories that I push, I'll get a count, how many people clicked on my stories. Now, whether they read through the whole thing or not, I won't know that, but clicks I'll get anywhere. I've gone as high as 100,000 on a story that I've posted to the web. On more than one occasion. It can be 20,000, 30,000, 40,000, but 100,000. And I'll go to that same story and I'll see how many times it got tweeted, and it'll be 7. How many times did it get posted to Facebook? 1,800 times it got shared on Facebook. So that kind of says it to me. Twitter's important. It's a tool. It helps brand us, and I agree with everything the panelists are saying today about social media and Twitter in particular. But I can't compete with Twitter when I get 100 million. We get 100 million page views on .com.
Lisa, did you have a final quick thought? And then I'll go to the professor.
I was going to say that I think Twitter can be a driver to the website for people that are interested in a particular topic. We haven't talked about hashtags, but they're a very powerful tool on Twitter, as you all know. And if you're interested in Utah politics, you follow the hashtag UTPOL, UTPOL. And it will drive you to different viewpoints, different tweeters that you may not know already. And you can use that to follow issues, for example. I have found personally, we do things a little differently at the Deseret News and the Tribune. We have DNews Politics is our all-purpose political Twitter handle, and a lot of us share that because the idea is that if you're interested in politics, if you follow us, we will tell you what's going on, whether it's the city, the county, the state, national, whatever it is we're covering that day. We try to drive it through DNews Politics. And we also try to follow up not just live tweeting events, but also follow up with a link once the story's posted. And maybe a link the next morning once the longer version that appears in print is posted. And anecdotally, I have found that aggressively tweeting links does drive people to stories. People are interested in, for example, the death of former Governor Bangerter this morning. I retweeted that a couple times, and I could just watch the numbers roll up as soon as it was tweeted, because people were interested, they wanted to read something, they follow that hashtag, they saw a link, they clicked on it. So it can be a useful tool to help people, help consumers find what they're looking for as well.
Professor, your thoughts on this?
I get to be a consumer these days to some degree. And so as a consumer, as I hear you all talk about driving numbers, I realize I'm using Twitter the way I read headlines in my newspaper. And so I'm kind of gleaning what's going on in the world quickly. And when one particularly interests me, then I'll stop and read until I run out of time or get bored or whatever. And then back to the point about credibility, one of the things I really appreciate that Twitter has done is the confirmed handles, you know, when they have confirmed celebrity handles, because again,
Oh, like verified?
verified,
Twitter
that's
The
verified.
blue check.
I became very
Yes.
popular in my own home when I came home with a Twitter verified one night. Mom's Twitter verified. I didn't realize that was a big deal. It is.
It's almost like being Facebook official.
I know. I am now Facebook official too.
I am
Who
none
knew?
of
I
those
didn't know
things.
that. That is a big deal, and it
It
makes
is a big
sense.
deal because in my old newsroom, when Twitter was just kind of gaining hold, I had a reporter who covered cops who would say, "Oh, that came from Twitter. It can't be true." But she wasn't, again, looking at the sources. And so the tweets that we saw coming from police or fire agencies, we knew were worth following because we knew those agencies. And we used to have, back in the day, pagers on our belts that would, Doug remembers. We used to have pagers and we had to pay extra for those. Now Twitter handles that role for us as news gatherers, but the source is truly important, and Twitter is making it easier to find verifiable sources. And as all my students know, journalism is a discipline of verification.
If I could just sort of provide a counterpoint, I guess, to some of what's been said, because the web hits are very important, but they've also created this phenomenon of the viral story, right? Where you know, the more hits, if you get a story that goes viral and gets 1 million hits or 1 million views or 2 million views or whatever, you know, that's great. You know, it brings in some money for the paper and or the publication, and it gets the name out there. But it also has sort of driven people to look for the viral story, and you see that in places like BuzzFeed and Huffington Post, and you see it in our newsroom as well sometimes. You know, there are stories that we might otherwise not do, but we're, oh wow, this is going to get a lot of web hits because it's quirky or it's weird, and people are interested in it, and there's no reason for people not to be interested in it. But in the way it starts, to the extent that starts driving the news and driving news judgment, I think that could be damaging and undermine the credibility, which goes
Call
back
that
to what
clickbait.
You know, it's interesting. Phil Gramm of the Washington Post years ago, he was actually apologizing for some errors in the Washington Post to the National Press Corps. And he said, please accept my apology. The Washington Post works for accuracy. I am making no excuses. However, I would beg this one indulgence to remember that our newspaper is the first rough draft of history. I've never forgotten that. It was in Katharine Graham's biography. And I thought about that, and this was a long time ago, obviously. Phil Graham's been gone a long, long time. And I wonder, what is the first rough draft of history today? Because I think Phil Gramm was right. But think of that era where you had the salty old editor going, what the hell is this? You know, fix this, you know, and then it would go through, I don't know how many eyes. It would go before, you know, the editorial board, depending on which page you were on. Then it would go to, depending on your time and space, you know, the typesetter, the linotype guy, whatever. There'd be how many sets of eyes and how many editors involved, in that first rough draft of history. Now it just spews and spills out. And something, too, that Robert said a moment ago is a pet peeve of mine. I call it cocooning. You can cocoon yourself. So you're only reading the blogs that agree with you. You're only on the major network that tends to agree with you. You're only listening to the talk show geek that tends to agree with you. You're only reading the columnist that tends to agree with you, where that wasn't the case when I grew up. You were exposed to all kinds. You had to be. You only had so very, very few outlets. Yeah, exactly. And if you counted NPR or, yeah, National Public Radio, or actually it was PBS, and actually there was another one, National Education Television, NET. That shows you how old I am. But what is the first rough draft of history today? And in your opinion, how dangerous is, I'll use my term, cocooning?
It has a listicle of 10 reasons why cat GIFs are the best. I think that a lot of this is, one thing that it has done, though, is removed a lot of those filters. And you can argue whether that's good or bad. It has given it to the people. It is, holy crap, I saw this, and check out this, picture I took of it, or this video, or whatever. It has taken there are a lot of news subjects, I believe, that would not have been covered had social media not existed. I wonder if Ferguson would have ever been as big as it became if a lot of the issues that were happening there would have even been covered had it not been for social media and people just directly documenting what they're seeing, what they're witnessing. And these are important conversations that we need to have. And so I think that as we look at that, the one thing that I would argue that journalism does do is, again, provide context and provide a nice encapsulation of these issues, asking these questions. A lot of times there's access to powerful people that the lay public does not necessarily have. We can go to the State House. We can say, you got questions about Healthy Utah? We can ask them to these guys because we have the access, you don't. And we can give you the answers. It's still being written, of course.
Can you encapsulate yourself, cocoon yourself, if you don't watch out? In other words, just listen to, read the tweets of, and so on.
I try not to. I try to consider
But
all
you're a
sources.
professional journalist.
Exactly, but that happens naturally. We all kind of tend to breakfast club ourselves, and we just sit, at the table next to the people that, we want to sit next to because we know that person and you're cool. And, we just, I think it's a human nature. And so I think, it's kind of has to be forced. You have to force yourself to listen to an alternative point of view.
That's what education is for.
Well, in the old days, that's what the general networks were for, too.
But were they really
Yes.
showing you
No, they were.
everything in the world? Or were
I'm the
they showing
moderator,
you
so
a
I shouldn't be doing
selective
this.
version?
But it was much, much different than it is today. You couldn't handpick your network. There might be just a little lean, CBS, NBC, ABC, but not like we see between MSN, and Fox. It's unprecedented. We've never seen this in the modern era of journalism. Anybody else want to chime in? I'm the moderator. I need to shut up.
Just one thought that came to mind when you mentioned the first draft of history, and I think it's interesting that the Library of Congress has started recording tweets now. They have a record of tweets now because this is sort of instant kind of the first reaction. Now is that the whole history? Obviously not, right? It is something that's getting out there, and it is sort of the immediate reaction. And I think Ben made a very valid point that it's now driving news, and we saw this going back all the way to when the Drudge Report first came out during the Clinton era. That was sort of the first example of the internet driving the news cycle, and I think we're going to see that. We've seen it more and more, and I think we're going to continue to see that.
I'd like to have others chime in on this too, including the professor. But Debbie and Lisa?
Lisa and I had this discussion on the way up about follow-up stories that I think, and this is part of the reason why we aren't as hyper-focused as I think we used to be on making sure we followed a story all the way through. Now, the obvious stories get followed. Two former attorneys general get arrested. Most of the media is going to follow that through the court proceedings. And inform the public what happens. But it's less obvious stories that we tend to jump on because everybody's jumping on it, because it's all over the Twitter feed, that we tend to forget about in the press and move on. And I'll often have people come up to me and say, you know, whatever happened with this story I saw on KSL or I saw in the newspaper, whatever became, I think, oh, we should check on that and figure out. Back in the day, and I mean, I started my career when we had the pagers on the side of our hips, and we had to stop and use a payphone to call in. You had to go to the courthouse and talk to people to get news stories. You couldn't just look up information online. You had to go wander through the State Office of Education or through the governor's office and get to know people one-on-one to get your stories. I mean, things have changed so much, and I think with the constant feeding of news and information, even to reporters, it becomes difficult to decipher what's most important. It's harder to keep our eye on the ball because the ball is all over the place. And I think Twitter, Facebook, to some degree, more so Twitter because of the alerting nature of tweets, has done that to us. And we're not as solid as we should be when it comes to making sure we're following up on those stories that we make a really big deal out of one day, and then they kind of fall to the wayside the next day.
I think one of the ways Twitter can be really useful to us as reporters, especially those of us who have a specialized area of emphasis, like in my case, politics, I can get on, I am on Twitter all day. I have TweetDeck set up. I follow hashtags by not just the UTPOL, but I follow them by what's breaking that day or whatever. I follow a lot of diverse people. I find out what people who are interested in politics are talking about and thinking about and discussing among themselves. It gives me an opportunity to listen in, if you will, on people's conversations from all walks of life, from all levels of interest in whatever the topic of the day is. I find that very useful. And I recognize that's a limited audience, right? But all of you are on Twitter almost, right? Almost all of you follow folks on Twitter. I think a lot of us do that anyway instinctually. We want to hear what our friends are talking about. If I walk into a room full of people that I know, hey, what's going on? What are you talking about? What's happening? Twitter is the social media version of that. And so I think it opens us up to being aware of what people want to hear from us. Hey, everyone today is talking about this particular piece of legislation, but we were thinking this was more important, and maybe we can make a case that it is, and we'll still do that story, but people want to hear more about this, and we can help them pull everything into perspective, as Ben and others have talked about, bringing that context to the story that you can't do in 140 characters. So I think there's some real pluses to social media in terms of exposing us as journalists to what those of you who are not journalists, who are media consumers, and frankly, we're all media consumers, right? What you want, what you care about, what you want to hear that day. I think that can be very, very useful in a lot of ways.
Professor, why don't you offer us a final thought on that, and then I'd like to entertain questions. So, and if you're more comfortable shouting out from where you are, great. Otherwise, please step up to the microphone.
My answer is no. Twitter is not the first draft of history. It's the reporter's notebook of history.
Good.
I think that's a fair point.
Yeah, I think that's, I want to take a step back. I don't want to hijack anything, but I do want to take a step back because this sort of goes to the fundamental issue. It's something that Debbie mentioned. The social media is not threatening journalism per se, but the internet has completely blown apart the economics of journalism that we experienced before.
Excellent
So when
point.
it comes to weighing investigative reporting versus tweeting, that's sort of not the right way to look at it. But investigative reporting takes a lot of money, a lot of time, and a lot of resources. I mean, we spent 9 months on the John Swallow investigation before we did our first story on it. We spent 6 months on Crandall Canyon before we got to congressional hearings and found out that there was malfeasance there. We spent 7 months writing a book about Mia Love. Now, these are all things that we're still able to do despite the model of journalism being blown apart by the internet. But it's hard to convince editors, especially in a cash-strapped economy, with our newsroom right now is half the size it was when I came back from DC 7 years ago. So it's hard to convince editors to devote the time and resources and manpower to those stories that are very important when there's all these other demands out there. Now, the advantage, as Lisa kind of touched on, is that, you know, we have fewer boots on the ground, we have fewer eyes and ears in House and Senate hearings. But one of the nice things about Twitter is people are there tweeting it. And so we can use those extra eyes and ears and boots on the ground as it's sort of a tip sheet. If something is blowing up in some committee room that we're not in, we can see it on Twitter and we can run over there and find it. But
Thanks,
that
Robert,
doesn't-
for all those times I did that.
it happens all the time. But that doesn't replace the sort of the fundamental mission that I feel like we have to do, and that is the investigative reporting piece.
And boy, that's a topic for another day, because he's absolutely right. I mean, first of all, how many organizations have the wherewithal, have the means, have the money, and have the willingness to face lawsuits? And I'll tell you, it's we've had that experience.
Well, if you do
within
it right,
Channel
you don't
5.
face lawsuits, Doug. Come on.
Oh, I don't know. Anybody can sue anybody, anytime,
Absolutely.
for anything.
It is definitely a huge commitment of time and finances to do
Right.
investigative journalism.
All right, let's go to some questions. First of all, over here.
I know this is kind of like in the olden days where they used to skip headlines, but my question's more for Robert here. You wrote a story earlier this year on a bill Representative Green was pushing that got rid of disclosures that he used to do.
Yeah.
How do you push people, how do you get people to, they need to know this news as opposed to what they want to know?
And maybe I could ask you to check and see if that microphone's turned on. Little switch there. Yeah,
Yeah,
Robert.
I mean, it kind of comes down to sort of what we talked a little bit about, the clickbait being, and the viral, you know, the thing that's going to get a lot of web hits is the thing that journalists focus on. The story he's talking about was there was a state representative that was sponsoring a bill that would have wiped out disclosures for these real estate transactions that his company specialized in. And the bill ultimately didn't pass, but it also so happened that his partners had sort of a long track record of things, of violations and some sort of shady dealings. And so it's a pretty important story. The question, how do you get it out there? Well, I mean, we make those news judgments, value judgments on a somewhat subjective basis, I guess, but you can see it in the newspaper. What's on the front page is what we think is important. You're absolutely right, though. With the internet, it's more of a stew, and you have to kind of pick through some of the stuff and find the stuff that is actually important. And as a result, a lot of stories that might otherwise be important news agenda driving stories or policy driving stories end up getting missed. And the answer, I'm not sure that there's a good answer to it. I think that sort of the democratizing, you put it out there and there are enough eyes and ears and it gets retweeted and reposted and things like that, it can take on a life of its own. Ideally, we'll ultimately get it out there, but a lot more often than not, you know, you've got to eat your broccoli, but it's the candy and the sweets, the dessert that ends up getting reposted.
And sometimes it's all about having that one person in a position to make a difference, see the story. And I go back to the story I did on meth homes, and this was about 8-9 years ago, that had been cleaned and cleared by the health department for occupancy, were still highly contaminated with methamphetamine based on testing that we did. And of course, the homeowners were buying these homes not knowing that they had been meth labs, right? There was no disclosure on real estate forms at the time that the home had been used to make meth, or that had been busted for methamphetamine labs. And a lawmaker saw that story at 10, and I got a call from him the very next morning, 9 a.m. He said, I'm heading up to Capitol Hill. I'm going to draft legislation, make it mandatory that you shall disclose that a home has been used as a meth lab. So, and now that is on real estate disclosure forms. And it was because of that one story. And it was because the right person saw the story, quite frankly, and not on the internet. He'd seen it at 10 o'clock that night.
Sir, your question.
Yes, it was very interesting about the extended commercial for Twitter. But I got burned on that one time and picked up a virus that cost me about $600 to get rid of. The thing is here that the news to me seems to be bringing out all the problems, but I rarely hear a solution. Doug, you were on the other morning on the heroin thing. And it's a great thing, but everybody was talking about the problem, but nobody was talking about a solution. Do you ever go out and try to find a solution to the problems you're bringing to the public?
I can answer for myself. Yeah, we do make that a high priority. Often we will talk about a problem, then we will seek the experts to bring in for a solution. Sometimes that's in a debate, sometimes it's in a roundtable. And I see it with my colleagues too. Although I think your criticism is generally valid. I really do. I think often, again, we can offer all kinds of excuses, but none are really truly valid. But sometimes it's a time frame. Sometimes you just have time to present and paint the initial concern, hope that it will take root somewhere. And as Debbie indicated, and I'm sure everybody else on this panel can talk about, sometimes we'll be talking about a problem. I'll have Representative Craig Powell call up and say, I'll carry that legislation. We can talk about another thing, and I can have Representative Paul Ray call up and say, I'll carry that legislation. This last time round, it was over people driving uninsured. I had Senator Lyle Hilliard call up and say, Doug, I'll carry that legislation. So your criticism, at least as far as I'm concerned, is absolutely valid. But
I'd like to meet with you after on the heroin problem.
What's that?
I'd like to meet with you after. I got hung up on your waiting for get on your radio show. I've been hung up more times on your radio show than anywhere else.
And I will take that criticism fairly. All right.
You should tweet your questions to Doug. I agree. So we have a mission statement at KSL, and I was so grateful when I returned to news in 2013 that we had this mission statement, because it keeps me very focused on what's important to the viewer. And part of that is solutions-oriented journalism. The flip side to that is sometimes there are multiple solutions, and there's not one solution to heroin, because there's different reasons for the use and the growing crisis that we have with heroin. However, I think it is critical that we address that because we do tend to throw out problems and we leave you feeling hopeless when there is hope.
I'm just a little uncomfortable with the suggestion, though, that we as reporters are the ones who should be out making solutions. We're not policymakers. We're supposed to focus on the problems and highlight the problems that are out there, maybe something that needs a solution, and inform the public. Because the reason I got into this business is because I always feel like that we live in a democracy and people make better decisions when they have all of the information that they need to have. And so my mission out there is to try to provide the information to people, highlight the problems that need to be addressed, and then trust the policymakers and the public and this great sort of government apparatus we have to come up with the best solutions possible.
You know, I really appreciate that comment too. And, you know, back to the heroin issue, you do ask yourself how much time you devote to it. Honestly, sir, we could devote weeks of airtime to the solution. And when we dealt with that, and I don't know if this is the show because we've talked about it several times, but we invited the deputy, I'm trying to remember his official title. Anyway, he's over the Pioneer Park area of Salt Lake City, and he is a deputy chief of police. And we had him in to talk about it, and he did offer solutions. He offered, we need more businesses in this area, we need more help in this area, we need more money for patrols in this area. So I'll be most interested to chat with you and get your thoughts on that. Anybody else have any comments on what the responsibility is of journalists to not only report the story and hopefully bring in some informed resources, but to serve up a solution as well?
Well, I think there, and I'm sorry, Ben, but going back to what Robert said, I think there were many times we do report news stories and there are already solutions in the works. And I think it's just a matter of, or there are organizations, and it's a matter of us going out and finding those different voices, not going back to the same voices all the time, but different voices in our community who are really working hard, whether it's on heroin or homeless issues, or, I mean, we could go over a whole plethora of issues to solve the problem, or at least bring hope to people who are dealing with these different issues. And sometimes I think, I know I see a lot of times the same people quoted over and over and over, whether it's in the newspaper or on television, and I think, oh my gosh, this is a really big state. And now we can actually have phones where we can call people who are out of state and ask them for their opinion too, or talk about programs that are working to help solve the problems that we're facing. Because I don't think we are in the business of just highlighting problems. I think we're in the business of reporting the news, and if there are groups out there that are working hard to resolve issues, we owe it to our viewers, our listeners, our readers to pursue those angles as well.
Before we run out of time, let's go to another question.
Hi. I read crack.com a lot, and they have a recurring theme article about news stories that go viral, but they're falsely reported, or they make false accusations. Do you feel Twitter and other social media is aggravating this problem, and do you feel the urge to get the news out first is causing these issues?
Oh Lord, there are times I want to scream at my screen and all of that. Yeah, there are occasions, especially, it's a version of the phone game too. If I tell you something, you tell that person something, and we'll see what it sounds like when it gets back over to Lisa here. And it is a version of that. That's why again, I'll go back to consider the source. Google is an amazing tool, and sometimes when people say something or reach out, you want to say, well, let's do a Google search. Let's find other sources. I encourage people to read multiple sources on a topic. It increases your breadth of knowledge too. I mean, as to what Doug said, where you go to this reaffirming, cocooning, you go to this channel, or this is my paper, or this is the website I go to because it reaffirms everything I believe. The problem with that is, you're not necessarily getting other perspectives, and I do encourage people to do that. I mean, it's more exacerbated in the viral situations, but it kind of is a hazard, you could say, of the internet.
Well, then it goes back to what I was saying earlier about professional news sources. Wherever you look for them, whether you pick up a printed copy of the paper, you go on the web, or you follow people on Twitter, or all of the above, you need to know that whoever you're getting your news from is someone who holds themselves to professional standards. And frankly, one of those standards is you don't report something you don't know. Even though you want to be first, even though you want to be very aggressive and competitive, Twitter is no different than what comes on the 10 o'clock news, or you hear when you turn on your radio, or you see in your printed paper. It should be information that's properly sourced, properly vetted, properly accounted for before it's reported. That said, because of the immediacy, sometimes something is not what it seems initially, and you have a responsibility as a professional journalist to follow up and make it clear. Hey, this person said this. We reported it as part of live tweeting an event, but now someone else is saying that's incorrect, and here's why. That's part of the choices you make as a journalist when you report an event. Someone is claiming this, someone else is claiming that. Live tweeting is no different. You have to make sure you get that balance in there. So again, consider your sources.
Robert.
And I just add briefly that the sort of the phenomenon of these viral stories and the sort of apocryphal stories going viral has sort of led to this whole creation of PolitiFact, and so, which won a Pulitzer Prize for doing fact-checking on political stories. And you've seen it, Washington Post as a fact-checker, and there are all these different fact-checkers out there that basically are just supposed to, dig out these fake stories out there like that.
Yes.
And Snopes. Always remember Snopes.
Final question.
If your day is consumed with following social media as an indication of what the public wants to know, how do you know that's an accurate barometer of what the public wants? Or is it just a subset? In other words, I would just say, is Twitter really the best indicator we have of what the larger business community expects from the media? And if your whole day is consumed with following Twitter, you may be talking about a real small subset of the larger consuming public. I'd be interested in your response.
Well, I was going to say the business community is certainly on Twitter, and certainly lets us all know what they're interested in having done for the community, for example. And it's not an all-consuming. As Debbie said, we used to have to actually go out and meet with people, or if we were really, really lucky as reporters, we had someone's home phone number, we could call them in the evening and talk to them. Well, no, now cell phones, texting, I do a lot of interviews by text now. It's there are all kinds of ways to reach out to people, and this is part of it. And frankly, the folks that are on Twitter, though, are going to be the people who are most engaged and most interested in what our product is. Some of it's a marketing consideration, I guess. We want to reach out to the people that are going to be consumers of our product, which is news. And sadly, that's not everybody anymore. But the people that are really interested in what's going on are looking for different ways to follow it, and Twitter is one way that they do. But trust me, we do still talk to people, and the business community is well represented by a lot of sources, including the chambers of commerce, who are also very active on social media and very active in engaging with reporters to remind us what we should be covering.
Let's go to Robert and then to Ben, and then we'll be clearly out of time.
I think it's a great point, though, because you do run the risk of like having this echo chamber, and it is the people who are on Twitter, the people who are on social media, are the ones who are the most engaged, and so it's going to be echoing louder. And you kind of do. There is an entire world of people who aren't on Twitter out there. But if you think about it, when we started in this business, when we were, when before social media, our world was sort of this big, right? And now when we have this social media, it's expanded to Facebook, and it's expanded to Twitter, and it's much bigger than it was. And I'm sure Ben has seen this too, where you have people who approach you with things, people you've never met before, who approach you on the street. Oh, I follow you on Twitter. I've got this great story for you. Or people who say, I've seen you on Facebook. And so it's we do still have the traditional, personal relationships and all of these sources that we've cultivated over the years, and then it's just sort of an additional way to expand that horizon even further. But yeah, there is this sort of shouting into a trash can, it bounces back at you, and you do run a risk of that, I think.
And I will just say, in defense of Twitter, I mean, yes, a lot of, when you post things on the internet, it is screaming into the void, but the people who I interact with on this are very engaged. These are people who want to know more information. They have a desire. They're seeking it out. They're seeking out the information. There's that level of engagement, and it's naturally required by some of these social media channels. It's not just necessarily a passive thing. But there is a valid point there. There is a world out there that isn't a part of this, but it's that balancing that we have to make, and it speaks to also us as journalists is, again, what people want necessarily or what they flock to cover. We'd be doing all Kim Kardashian news all the time. What they ought to know about, healthcare, what they ought to know about what their lawmakers are doing with their lives. It's also incumbent upon us to present that as well.
Yes, please.
I'd like to just add one quick thing to that. It's our job as journalists to make the important stuff interesting. And whether that's on Twitter or in a story or on a broadcast, it doesn't matter. It's our job to find out what's important for you to know and to make you care. And that's what I'm trying to teach my students.
Thank you so much for being such a great audience. Thank you again.
And I want to thank all of the panelists and Doug Wright for coming all the way up from across campus and up from Salt Lake through the ice and the snow. We know it's a long way from Salt Lake, so we appreciate it. Thank you. And I'm going to give them all Walker Institute water bottles so that they can go out in the world and tell everyone about Weber State and the Walker Institute. Thank you.